Envision this scenario. You're seated across from someone in 2025's most exclusive virtual venue, ambient neon blues and purples illuminating your features, and with a handful of strategically crafted phrases, you observe their pupils dilate, their body language shift toward engagement, and suddenly they're captivated by your every word. What if I revealed that this seemingly magical transformation isn't mystical at all, but rather the sophisticated application of cognitive biases that silently orchestrate every human interaction? What if you could master the art of engaging these hidden psychological mechanisms, transforming attraction from mere chance into something that feels like inevitable connection? Before we explore these fascinating psychological territories, let me establish something fundamental. Understanding how the human mind operates should never serve as a tool for manipulation or exploitation. Authentic connection flourishes through genuine authenticity, mutual respect, and sincere interest in another person's complete humanity. What we're examining today is the compelling science of ethical influence, not a manual for deception. Consider it like understanding the mechanics behind a masterful illusion, not to deceive others, but to appreciate the sophisticated craftsmanship and perhaps recognize when others might misuse these powerful techniques. Here's where the science becomes absolutely captivating. Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky's revolutionary prospect theory research from 1979 unveiled something remarkable about human psychology. We're far from the rational beings we believe ourselves to be. Instead, our neural architecture contains systematic biases that render us predictably irrational in specific contexts. In matters of attraction and social bonding, these cognitive patterns function like concealed pathways into the unconscious mind. Kahneman demonstrated that our fear of losing what we possess significantly outweighs our desire to acquire something new, a phenomenon known as loss aversion. Within romantic contexts, this means the anxiety of missing a potential connection often proves more compelling than the actual attraction itself. Robert Cialdini's 6 Principles of Influence, documented through his groundbreaking research, reveal how our minds respond to subtle psychological cues. Reciprocity creates an unconscious obligation to return even minimal favors. Scarcity intensifies desire when we perceive something as rare or time-limited. Social proof operates on our tendency to validate our choices through others' behaviors. If people find someone attractive, we're naturally inclined to agree. Authority makes us more receptive to individuals we perceive as credible experts. Consistency compels us to align our actions with our stated beliefs and past commitments. And the principle of liking, perhaps the most intuitive yet undervalued factor, demonstrates how we're more easily influenced by those we find appealing or similar to ourselves. The psychological complexity deepens further. Antonio Damasio's paradigm-shifting 1994 research dismantled the myth of purely rational decision-making. Through studying patients with damage to their emotional brain centers, he discovered something extraordinary. Without emotional input, humans literally cannot make decisions. Every choice we make, from selecting breakfast to falling in love, originates from emotional responses that occur milliseconds before our conscious awareness activates. This means attraction, fundamentally, represents an emotional decision that our rational mind later justifies through logical reasoning. Even Sigmund Freud, despite his controversial theoretical framework, identified enduring truths about human nature. The id, our instinctual desire center, operates through what he termed the pleasure principle, constantly seeking immediate gratification while avoiding discomfort. When someone simultaneously activates our primal responses and engages our higher cognitive functions, they create an almost irresistible psychological synergy that we experience as magnetic attraction. Allow me to share a personal experience that demonstrates these psychological forces in action. Several years ago, I attended a professional networking event feeling genuinely uncomfortable and out of place. Rather than engaging in conventional small talk, I chose a different approach. I approached an individual who appeared genuinely engaged and said, "I need to be transparent. I find these events challenging, but I noticed you seem to be thriving here. I'm curious about your approach." This simple opening accomplished something remarkable. It employed reciprocal vulnerability to establish immediate rapport, utilized social proof by acknowledging their apparent social success, and created perceived scarcity by suggesting their positive energy was uncommon in that environment. The resulting conversation was genuinely engaging, filled with authentic love. echte and meaningful exchange. However, I later questioned whether that connection was authentic or if I had unconsciously manipulated the situation using psychological principles. This reflection touches the core ethical consideration we're addressing. When does influence cross into manipulation? When does psychological understanding become exploitation? The distinction lies in intention and outcome. If your objective is fostering genuine connection, mutual enjoyment, and authentic relationships, then understanding these principles can genuinely enhance your ability to create meaningful bonds with others. However, if your goal involves deception, exploitation, or taking advantage of someone's psychological vulnerabilities, you're entering ethically problematic territory. What makes this particularly fascinating in 2025 is how our understanding of these cognitive mechanisms has evolved beyond traditional psychological studies. Modern neuroscience provides unprecedented insights into attraction's neurological foundations. We now understand that when someone experiences attraction, specific neural pathways activate, releasing precise combinations of dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin that create what we subjectively experience as chemistry or magnetic connection. The question likely resonating in your mind is this: if these psychological mechanisms are so influential and they operate beneath our conscious awareness, what exactly are they? How do they function? And crucially, how can you recognize when they're being employed on you? This brings me to something I'm genuinely interested in exploring with you, and I'd love your perspective in the comments. We've discussed several cognitive biases today: scarcity, which intensifies desire when something appears rare or limited, and reciprocity, which creates psychological pressure to return favors or kindness. If you had to identify one of these biases as most significant for understanding human attraction, which would you choose? Scarcity or reciprocity? Here's an even more intriguing question. Can you recall an instance when you felt powerfully drawn to someone or something, only to later recognize that one of these psychological principles was influencing your response? I'd love to hear about those aha moments in the comments. I read every response, and your insights often inspire future content. Because if these invisible psychological forces are continuously shaping every interaction we experience, shouldn't we understand precisely how they operate? We've established that these invisible psychological mechanisms exist, silently orchestrating attraction and influence beneath every conversation, every meaningful glance, every moment of genuine connection. But what if I revealed that in 2025, understanding these biases has transcended academic theory? Envision accessing your smartphone during a social encounter and having an AI application that identifies cognitive biases as they activate in real time, both within yourself and the person across from you. Picture discrete notifications appearing, anchoring bias detected, social proof mechanism activated, unconscious mirroring in progress. This may sound like speculative fiction, but it's remarkably closer to our current reality than most people realize, with implications that are simultaneously fascinating and concerning. Let's examine anchoring bias, arguably one of the most influential and sophisticated psychological phenomena in human interaction. Daniel Kahneman's pivotal 1982 research revealed something extraordinary about information processing. The initial data point we encounter about any subject becomes the reference anchor for all subsequent evaluations. In practical application, this means the impression you establish within the first moments of meeting someone literally restructures how they interpret every subsequent interaction. When you present with confidence and genuine intrigue, that becomes their foundational understanding of your character. Conversely, if you appear hesitant or uncertain, that uncertainty becomes the lens through which they view all future exchanges. Here's where the science becomes particularly compelling. Anchoring operates beyond first impressions alone. Strategic communicators and negotiators continuously reset anchoring points throughout interactions, and experimental evidence is remarkable. When researchers instructed participants to record the final 2 digits of their social security numbers, then participate in auction bidding, individuals with higher digit combinations consistently placed higher bids. Their arbitrary personal numbers became value anchors for completely unrelated items. Now consider applying this principle to attraction dynamics. When you establish a high-value perception anchor early in an interaction, Everything that follows gets interpreted through that elevated framework. However, anchoring represents merely the foundation of this psychological framework. Solomon Asch's groundbreaking conformity studies from 1951 revealed something profound about human nature. Our susceptibility to social influence far exceeds our conscious awareness. In his renowned line judgment experiments, participants would literally contradict their own visual evidence to conform with a group's demonstrably incorrect consensus. Social proof, as it turns out, possesses such psychological power that it can override our most fundamental perceptual abilities. In 2025's hyperconnected environment, this bias has been systematically leveraged through AI algorithms capable of instantly generating artificial social proof. Contemporary dating platforms employ sophisticated systems displaying precise metrics of likes, views, and matches, creating manufactured scarcity and social validation. The chameleon effect, identified by Tanya Chartrand and John Bargh in 1999, unveils our unconscious tendency toward behavioral mirroring. Without conscious awareness, we automatically replicate posture, gestures, speech patterns, and even respiratory rhythms of individuals we find attractive or wish to connect with. This automatic synchronization generates subtle yet powerful rapport and perceived similarity. The person being mirrored experiences an intuitive comfort and familiarity, as though you're operating on the same psychological frequency. I discovered the chameleon affect's complexities through personal experience, which has become one of my most instructive examples regarding the nuanced application of psychological techniques. I was spending time with a colleague who possessed this genuinely engaging, distinctive laugh, a rhythmic pattern that was authentically charming. Unconsciously, I began mirroring this laugh during our conversations. Initially, it fostered genuine connection and shared enjoyment. However, I made the critical error of transferring this borrowed behavioral pattern to other social contexts. The issue: I significantly overcompensated. Rather than natural mirroring, I was performing an exaggerated version of my colleague's laugh, which appeared either mockingly insincere or completely artificial. What should have been subtle rapport building became social awkwardness, teaching me that effective mirroring requires an extremely delicate balance between authentic connection and performative mimicry. Friedrich Nietzsche's concept of will to power provides additional psychological insight into these dynamics. He theorized that all human behavior fundamentally stems from the desire to exert influence and maintain control over our environment and relationships. While this perspective might seem cynical, it actually explains our susceptibility to cognitive biases. They engage our deepest motivations for power, connection, and survival. When someone successfully activates our psychological biases, they're essentially accessing our fundamental drive for influence, making connection with them feel aligned with our personal interests. Conversely, Seneca, the ancient Stoic philosopher, cautioned against the inherent vulnerabilities in human desire. He recognized that our acquisitive nature could become our greatest weakness, rendering us susceptible to manipulation and compromised decision-making. In our contemporary context, this wisdom proves increasingly relevant. Understanding cognitive biases isn't solely about strategic application. It's about protecting yourself from those who might exploit your psychological vulnerabilities. Robert Zajunk's mere exposure effect from 1968 introduces another crucial dimension to this psychological landscape. His research demonstrated that we develop preferences for stimuli simply through repeated exposure. The more familiar we become with someone's appearance, voice, or presence, the more attractive they appear, often without any rational basis for increased appeal. This explains why AI-driven social media algorithms prove so remarkably effective. They can systematically increase your exposure to specific individuals, concepts, or products until you develop genuine preference and attraction. What makes this particularly intriguing in 2025 is how technology amplifies these fundamental psychological patterns. AI systems can analyze microexpressions during real-time video communications, tracking precisely when interest intensifies or diminishes. Machine learning algorithms can identify the exact language, vocal tones, and timing that activate specific cognitive biases in individual users. Dating applications have evolved into psychological research laboratories, conducting large-scale experiments on human attraction and utilizing results to influence user behavior in ways we're only beginning to comprehend. Here's what I find most compelling. These biases are actively operating in your daily experience right now, regardless of your conscious awareness. Every marketing message you encounter, every social interaction you engage in, every decision you make receives subtle influence from these psychological principles. The question isn't whether cognitive biases affect you. The question is whether you recognize when they're activated. Let me pose a question that I'd genuinely like you to consider and discuss in the comments. What's one cognitive bias you've observed operating in your own life? Perhaps you've noticed yourself desiring something more intensely simply because it appeared scarce, or feeling increased attraction to someone after observing others' positive responses to them. Maybe you've recognized that you unconsciously mirror people you find appealing, or realized that your initial impression of someone fundamentally shaped how you interpreted all their subsequent actions. These observations aren't indicators of weakness or naivety. They're evidence of your humanity, complete with all the sophisticated psychological mechanisms that define human experience. Because now that we've identified these mental influence points, now that we understand the specific mechanisms underlying attraction and influence, only one question remains. What would happen if you deliberately applied these insights in real-world situations? What if I revealed that one strategically designed evening could definitively demonstrate whether these cognitive biases can authentically create profound attraction? More critically, what if that same experience unveiled a hidden psychological cost that most people never consider? Allow me to guide you through a compelling scenario that synthesizes everything we've explored, a real-world psychology experiment unfolding within the sophisticated social landscape of 2025. Envision this setting. You're at an exclusive rooftop venue in the city center, urban lights creating a mesmerizing tapestry of possibilities below. The person you've been hoping to connect with is present, looking genuinely captivating under the carefully designed ambient lighting. Tonight, however, rather than depending solely on chance or natural charisma, you're equipped with deep psychological insight. This isn't manipulation, understand. It's strategic authenticity, leveraging scientific principles to enhance genuine human connection. The evening begins with reciprocity, one of the most foundational elements of social psychology. Rather than approaching with conventional conversation starters, you observe them having difficulty catching the bartender's attention. You smoothly intervene, ordering their drink alongside yours, establishing immediate psychological reciprocity. This isn't calculated manipulation. It's authentic helpfulness that happens to activate one of humanity's most powerful social responses. Robert Cialdini's extensive research demonstrated that people experience genuine compulsion to return favors, even minimal ones, and this simple gesture has just activated that fundamental psychological mechanism. As conversation develops, the halo effect begins its sophisticated influence. Richard Nisbett and Timothy Wilson's landmark 1977 research revealed that when people find one characteristic attractive, they automatically attribute additional positive qualities. When you demonstrate intellectual curiosity through an astute observation about the venue's architectural design, suddenly you're not merely intelligent, you're perceived as humorous, successful, and compelling across multiple dimensions. The halo effect creates cascading positive assumptions that amplify every subsequent interaction. The evening takes a particularly intriguing direction when you suggest moving toward the venue's edge, where the spectacular view comes with railings just low enough to create subtle height-induced physiological arousal. This isn't coincidental. It's deliberate application of Dutton and Aaron's influential 1974 bridge study, where men who encountered an attractive woman on an anxiety-inducing suspension bridge were significantly more likely to contact her later than those meeting her on stable ground. The researchers discovered we frequently misattribute physiological arousal to romantic attraction. You're elevated. Heart rate from mild height anxiety gets reinterpreted as excitement about your companion. Helen Fisher's neuroscience research from 2004 illuminates exactly what's occurring in both brains during this moment. When attraction activates, neural pathways flood with dopamine, generating intense focus and energy. Norepinephrine heightens attention while triggering accelerated heartbeat and physiological arousal. Simultaneously, serotonin levels decrease, causing obsessive focus on the other person. You're essentially observing someone's neurochemistry transform in real time, with your strategic psychological approach catalyzing this remarkable biological symphony. Carl Jung's concept of the shadow introduces a more complex psychological dimension to this scenario. Jung theorized that we all possess suppressed personality aspects that emerge when we're attempting to embody someone we believe others desire. As the evening progresses and you witness these techniques' effectiveness, you might begin questioning your authentic motivations. Are you genuinely connecting with this person or performing carefully choreographed psychological theater? I'll share an experience that illustrates how rapidly these techniques can backfire when pushed beyond appropriate boundaries. I was attending a social gathering several years ago and decided to experiment with manufactured scarcity. I'd been engaged in genuinely interesting conversation with someone, and the interaction was flowing naturally. However, attempting to be strategically clever, I created artificial urgency by mentioning I needed to leave soon for another commitment, completely fabricated naturally. The intention was triggering their fear of missing out to intensify interest. Instead, the result was remarkably counterproductive. They became immediately more engaged, asking detailed questions about this mysterious obligation, forcing me to continually elaborate on this fictional commitment. By evening's end, I'd constructed such an intricate deception about this non-existent responsibility that I actually had to leave early to maintain credibility. This taught me that artificial scarcity can be effective, but only when built upon authentic foundations. Returning to our hypothetical evening, as the night deepens, you observe something extraordinary occurring. Every psychological principle you've implemented is functioning in perfect synchronization. The initial reciprocity has evolved into genuine mutual exchange. The halo effect has created an atmosphere where your observations seem more insightful, more compelling. The arousal misattribution from environmental stimulation and evening excitement is being interpreted as intense chemistry. You're witnessing real-time attraction construction through scientific principles, and the experience feels remarkably powerful. However, here's the question that should resonate as you observe these techniques' effectiveness. Is this sustainable? What occurs tomorrow when the neurochemical effects diminish and psychological triggers lose potency? Fisher's research shows that brain attraction chemicals naturally fade over time, replaced by different neurochemical patterns associated with long-term bonding. If your initial connection was constructed primarily on triggered biases rather than genuine compatibility, what foundation exists for enduring relationship? The immediate success feels intoxicating, doesn't it? There's compelling power in understanding precisely which psychological mechanisms to activate and observing predictable responses. But as the evening concludes and you've successfully created what feels like perfect attraction, a more challenging question emerges. If these feelings can be manufactured so systematically, how authentic are they fundamentally? I want you to engage with this scenario in the comments, because here's what I find particularly fascinating. What if we could replay this exact evening while removing just one psychological element? What if you eliminated the social proof factor entirely? No external validation of attractiveness from others? What if you removed the arousal misattribution and met in a completely neutral, calm environment? Or what if you bypassed the reciprocity opener and began with genuine, unstrategic conversation? How do you believe each alternative scenario would unfold differently? Because as we contemplate the aftermath of this perfectly orchestrated psychological evening, observing manufactured attraction develop into something that feels authentically profound, we're compelled to address the most crucial question. When does influence transform into manipulation? And what are we truly achieving when we master psychological persuasion? But what if mastering these cognitive biases doesn't transform you into the strategic mastermind you envisioned? What if, paradoxically, in learning to influence others' psychological mechanisms, you've become ensnared within those very same mental frameworks? As we step back from our hypothetical evening of psychological orchestration, savoring what feels like successfully manufactured attraction, a more profound question emerges. When you become fluent in psychological influence, who are you fundamentally becoming? Sigmund Freud's structural model of personality provides a compelling framework for examining this internal transformation. Your id, that primitive psychological force pursuing immediate gratification, celebrates these newfound capabilities. It perceives cognitive biases as sophisticated tools for obtaining desires without the complex vulnerabilities of authentic connection. Your superego, however, that internalized moral compass, grows increasingly concerned about the ethical implications of your psychological arsenal. Caught between these opposing forces sits your ego, struggling to rationalize these techniques while preserving psychological integrity and self-respect. Niccolò Machiavelli would have found cognitive bias research absolutely fascinating. His principle that outcomes justify methods and that effective leadership sometimes requires strategic cunning aligns perfectly with sophisticated psychological influence. From this Machiavellian perspective, if understanding cognitive biases facilitates meaningful connections, career advancement, or relationship success, then these techniques represent morally neutral instruments. The critical question isn't whether to employ them, but whether you possess sufficient skill for effective implementation. Arthur Schopenhauer's philosophical worldview suggests something far more troubling. His concept of will as existence's fundamental driving force, perpetually generating desire and suffering, implies that mastering these biases might actually amplify your own psychological distress. When you develop hyper-awareness of psychological techniques operating around you, when you begin analyzing every interaction through cognitive manipulation frameworks, you risk losing capacity for genuine, spontaneous human connection. Social reality transforms into strategic calculation where every gesture is analyzed, every emotion questioned, and authentic intimacy becomes increasingly elusive. Daniel Kahneman's distinction between System 1 and System 2 thinking, articulated in his influential Thinking, Fast and Slow, introduces additional philosophical complexity. System 1 represents our rapid, intuitive emotional processing, the domain where cognitive biases operate most effectively. System 2 encompasses deliberate, analytical, rational thinking, where we examine and question initial responses. When you become skilled at triggering others' System 1 reactions while maintaining your own System 2 analytical engagement, you create fundamental relationship asymmetry. You're essentially playing an entirely different psychological game, constantly calculating while others experience pure emotion. Ancient Stoic philosophers, particularly Epictetus, understood something enduring about human psychology that remains remarkably relevant. He taught that while we cannot control external circumstances, we maintain complete authority over our judgments and responses. Applied to cognitive bias understanding, this Stoic wisdom suggests genuine psychological freedom emerges not from learning to manipulate others, but from developing personal immunity to manipulation. When you recognize that your perceptions and emotional reactions remain largely under conscious control, you become less susceptible to the very techniques you might employ on others. Contemporary emotional intelligence research echoes these philosophical insights. Individuals with elevated emotional intelligence excel not only at reading and influencing others, they also demonstrate heightened awareness when being influenced themselves. This creates a fascinating paradox. Increasing psychological sophistication might lead to greater relationship isolation, as you become constantly aware of psychological dynamics others experience unconsciously. Allow me to share a personal experience that illustrates the complex psychological territory this knowledge creates. During university, I developed intense attraction to someone in my philosophy seminar who seemed entirely beyond my reach, intellectually brilliant, naturally charismatic, effortlessly magnetic. Rather than approaching directly, I decided to strategically employ the halo effect. I ensured my intelligence was prominently displayed during class discussions, positioned myself as culturally knowledgeable, and carefully cultivated intellectual sophistication. The strategy worked remarkably well. They began initiating conversations, seeking my perspectives on various topics, and I felt like a psychological strategist extraordinaire. The halo effect was generating exactly the positive assumption cascade I'd anticipated. Then reality demolished my carefully constructed psychological architecture with devastating precision. During one particularly engaging philosophical discussion, they casually mentioned how much they valued having a friend who could explore complex ideas without romantic complications. Friend, that single word struck with psychological force. I realized that while I'd been strategically deploying the halo effect to generate romantic attraction, they had been experiencing it purely platonically. My sophisticated psychological maneuvering had successfully established me as an intellectually interesting person worth knowing, just not in the manner I'd intended. The irony became clear. I'd essentially outmaneuvered myself, applying psychological principles so effectively that I'd created precisely the opposite of my actual objective. This experience revealed something crucial about psychological sophistication's double-edged nature. When you begin viewing human interactions through cognitive bias and strategic influence frameworks, you risk disconnecting from the spontaneous, unpredictable, beautifully chaotic essence of genuine human connection. You become so focused on attraction mechanics that you lose sight of its inherent magic. Stoic philosophy would argue this demonstrates exactly why we should concentrate on controlling our responses rather than attempting to control others. Epictetus taught that authentic freedom emerges from accepting what lies beyond our control while taking complete responsibility for what remains within it. In the context of modern psychological research and cognitive bias understanding, this might mean applying your knowledge not for manipulating others, but for protecting yourself from manipulation while approaching relationships with greater self-awareness and authenticity. Here's where philosophical theory meets psychological reality. I'm genuinely curious about your perspective. In the comments below, share which approach resonates more powerfully: the Stoic path of maintaining composed detachment while focusing on your own responses, or the Nietzschean embrace of will to power, actively using these psychological tools to shape your reality. This transcends academic discussion. It's a fundamental choice about navigating human relationships in an era of unprecedented psychological understanding. Because as we've witnessed these techniques demonstrate their effectiveness in our hypothetical scenario, as we've experienced the intoxicating power of understanding and triggering cognitive biases, we're approaching a critical psychological reckoning. What happens when these carefully constructed strategies encounter the messy, unpredictable reality of actual human beings who refuse to conform to our psychological expectations? What if I revealed that your carefully crafted foundation of psychological influence could crumble in an instant, leaving you more profoundly isolated than you ever thought possible? What if the very techniques that appeared to grant you extraordinary social capabilities actually constructed a psychological prison where authentic intimacy becomes not merely challenging, but fundamentally unattainable? Consider this progression. You've invested considerable time mastering cognitive bias applications. You've successfully employed anchoring to generate compelling first impressions, leveraged social proof to enhance your desirability, and perfected the chameleon effect to establish immediate rapport with virtually anyone. Your relationship success has reached unprecedented levels, your social network has expanded exponentially, and you feel you've decoded some fundamental secret of human connection. Then, initially subtle but increasingly obvious, everything begins to deteriorate. Roy Baumeister's influential 1998 research on ego depletion illuminates something critical about the psychological toll of continuous self-regulation and strategic social performance. Like any overworked system, our capacity for sustained self-control and calculated interpersonal behavior operates within finite parameters. When you're perpetually monitoring your conduct, calculating psychological impacts, and maintaining a meticulously crafted persona, you're depleting a mental resource that doesn't easily replenish. The consequences: emotional burnout, cognitive exhaustion, and diminishing ability to sustain the very techniques that initially appeared effortless. What proves even more concerning is how this psychological depletion distorts your perception of others. Operating from mental exhaustion, you develop hypervigilance regarding others' motivations, constantly suspecting they're employing identical techniques against you. Every compliment appears calculated, every affectionate gesture seems strategically motivated, and every genuine moment becomes questionable. You've essentially constructed a paranoid framework where authentic human interaction feels impossible because you're convinced everyone else is engaged in the same psychological strategy game you've mastered. Jean Twenge's comprehensive loneliness research, extensively documented since 2017, reveals that despite unprecedented connectivity through digital platforms and dating applications, people are experiencing epidemic-level isolation and disconnection. The devastating irony: those most skilled in psychological manipulation often experience the most profound loneliness. When you understand precisely how to manufacture attraction, generate rapport, and influence behavior, you begin questioning whether anyone genuinely appreciates your authentic self or merely responds to the carefully orchestrated psychological performance you've created. Joseph Ledoux's neuroscience research on fear and emotional memory from 1996 explains why this psychological backlash can prove so destructive. When we experience social rejection or discover our relationships were built on manipulation rather than authentic connection, our brains encode these experiences as significant threats. The amygdala, our neural alarm system, becomes hypersensitive to similar future situations. Once you've experienced relationship collapse built on psychological techniques, your brain becomes programmed to anticipate and fear similar outcomes, making genuine vulnerability feel impossibly dangerous. Arthur Schopenhauer's philosophical analysis of human desire provides an ideal framework for understanding this psychological paradox. He identified what we might term the intimacy contradiction. We desperately seek closeness with others, yet the very process of becoming close reveals our imperfections, vulnerabilities, and authentic selves, which we fear will repel others. When you introduce psychological manipulation into this dynamic, the contradiction becomes exponentially more complex. You're not simply afraid of revealing your genuine self, you're terrified that your authentic identity isn't worthy of affection without psychological enhancement. Let me share a personal experience that demonstrates how rapidly and painfully this backlash can manifest. I maintained a close friendship that I believed was founded on genuine mutual respect and connection. Reflecting honestly, however, I realized I had unconsciously applied reciprocity principles throughout our relationship. I consistently provided thoughtful gestures, remembered significant personal details, and positioned myself as exceptionally considerate and supportive. While it felt natural and authentic then, I was actually creating subtle psychological obligation and indebtedness. The relationship fractured when they encountered a challenging life situation, requiring genuine emotional support that demanded authentic vulnerability from me, not strategic compassion. When I found myself unable to abandon my psychologically sophisticated approach and simply be present with their suffering, they confronted me directly. "You're constantly performing," they observed. "I never feel like I'm connecting with your real self." The most painful part, they were completely accurate. I had become so proficient at using psychological principles to maintain relationships that I'd lost the capacity to simply be myself with another person. The aftermath proved devastating. Beyond losing a genuinely valued friendship, I began questioning every relationship in my life. Had I been unconsciously manipulating everyone? Were any of my connections authentic? Or was I simply a psychological orchestrator who'd forgotten he was directing the performance? The subsequent paranoia and self-doubt exceeded any rejection I'd previously experienced because they attacked my fundamental identity and self-worth. This is where Schopenhauer's pessimistic philosophy becomes almost prophetic. He argued that human desire itself generates suffering. We crave what we lack, fear losing what we possess, and even achieving our desires leads to rapid dissatisfaction and renewed craving. Applied to psychological manipulation, this creates perfect existential misery. You desire authentic connection but fear being authentic. You achieve superficial success through psychological techniques, but become haunted by knowledge of its artificiality. What makes this backlash particularly devastating in 2025 is technology's amplification of these psychological dynamics. AI-powered social platforms can detect influence technique usage, dating applications can identify manipulative behavior patterns, and people are developing increasing sophistication in recognizing psychological manipulation. The very techniques that seemed cutting-edge and effective are becoming transparent and obvious to others, creating a psychological arms race that ultimately benefits no one. Here's what I want you to contemplate, and please share your perspectives in the comments. Have you ever experienced backlash from using psychological influence techniques, whether consciously or unconsciously? Perhaps a relationship that felt artificial once you realized you'd been performing rather than being authentic, or a moment when you questioned whether people appreciated your genuine self or just the strategic version you'd constructed. These experiences aren't merely cautionary tales, they're pathways toward something more meaningful. Because as we survey the aftermath of psychological manipulation gone wrong, surrounded by the remnants of relationships built on cognitive biases rather than genuine connection, one crucial question remains unaddressed. Is there a way to transform this knowledge and apply it not for manipulation, but for something far more valuable and sustainable? What if I revealed that every cognitive bias we've examined, every psychological mechanism that appeared potentially manipulative, could actually become your most powerful instrument for fostering genuine, enduring, and ethically grounded connections? What if the very insights that initially led toward isolation and mistrust could be transformed into exceptional capabilities for authentic intimacy and meaningful relationships? Here's the remarkable paradox we've been developing. Understanding cognitive biases doesn't necessarily transform you into a manipulator. It can evolve you into a more conscious, empathetic, and genuinely compelling human being. The identical psychological principles that can be exploited for selfish purposes can be redirected toward creating the kind of connections that truly enrich both your life and the lives of those around you. Let's completely reconceptualize reciprocity. Rather than employing this principle to manufacture artificial obligations, consider using your reciprocity understanding to become authentically generous. When you recognize that people naturally feel inclined to return kindness, you can choose to give freely without expectation, understanding that your genuine generosity will organically inspire reciprocal generosity. This isn't manipulation, it's conscious compassion that generates positive relationship dynamics. Jean Dissetti and Philip Jackson's 2004 empathy research revealed something profound about human connection. Individuals skilled at recognizing and understanding others' emotional experiences don't merely become superior manipulators. They become exceptional partners, friends, and community contributors. When you apply cognitive bias knowledge to better comprehend what others are experiencing rather than exploiting their vulnerabilities, you transform from a psychological predator into a psychological ally. Reconsider anchoring through an entirely different lens. Instead of using initial impressions to construct false personas, leverage your anchoring understanding to establish honest, healthy relationship foundations from the outset. When you recognize that first impressions carry disproportionate influence, you can choose to anchor others' perceptions in your authentic values, genuine interests, and real personality characteristics. This creates relationships built on solid ground rather than the unstable foundation of deception. The Stoic practices we explored become incredibly powerful when applied to personal psychological well-being. Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus taught that genuine strength emerges from controlling your responses to external circumstances, not from controlling the circumstances themselves. When you understand scarcity bias, you can recognize artificial urgency manipulation and make decisions from calm rationality rather than fear-driven impulse. You develop immunity to the very techniques others might attempt to use against you. Freudian insights, though often considered outdated, actually provide essential tools for ethical psychological development. When you understand the dynamic tension between your id's immediate desires, your superego's moral imperatives, and your ego's balancing attempts, you can make conscious relationship choices. This self-awareness prevents unconscious manipulation of others because you maintain honesty about your own motivations and intentions. Let me share an experience that demonstrates how profoundly this ethical reframing can transform your connections. Approximately a year ago, I encountered someone at a professional conference who appeared remarkably interesting, but also somewhat reserved and cautious about new relationships. Previous versions of myself might have deployed various psychological techniques to penetrate their defenses and manufacture artificial rapport. Instead, I chose to apply my cognitive bias understanding to create authentic connection opportunities. I recognized they were likely experiencing social proof pressure at the conference, feeling obligated to network and create impressive professional connections. Rather than contributing to that pressure, I explicitly acknowledged it. I offered something like, "These events can feel incredibly performative. Would you prefer having a genuine conversation about something you're genuinely passionate about?" This approach utilized my social dynamics understanding not for manipulation, but to provide relief from manipulative environments. I also observed indicators suggesting they might be experiencing cognitive overwhelm from excessive conversations, so I suggested stepping outside for fresh air. This wasn't strategic maneuvering to create arousal misattribution. It was conscious choice-making to establish a more comfortable environment for authentic dialogue. The result was among the most genuine, engaging conversations I'd experienced in months, leading to a friendship that continues enriching my life. What distinguished this interaction from previous psychological experiments? I was applying my knowledge to serve the other person's well-being, not merely my personal agenda. Instead of asking, "How can I make this person appreciate me?" I was asking, "How can I create conditions where we can both be authentic?" That intentional shift completely transformed the entire dynamic and outcome. This ethical approach to cognitive bias mastery generates what psychologists term positive reciprocal influence. When you employ psychological sophistication to help others feel more comfortable, understood, and valued, they naturally respond with enhanced openness and authenticity. You're not manipulating them into appreciation. You're establishing conditions where mutual respect can develop organically. The beautiful irony: this ethical approach proves more effective than manipulation for creating sustainable relationships. When people sense your genuine interest in their well-being, rather than simply trying to impress them or extract something from them, they lower psychological defenses and reveal their authentic selves. When you're engaging with someone's genuine identity rather than their social performance, you can develop the profound connection that manipulation can never achieve. Here's what genuinely intrigues me, and I want your engagement in the comments. Which of these ethical psychology applications appeals more strongly? Developing capability to identify when scarcity bias is being used to pressure your decisions, or mastering empathetic mirroring, where you reflect others' emotions not for manipulation, but to help them feel truly understood. Both approaches employ identical psychological knowledge we've explored, but they transform the framework from exploitation to empowerment. Because as we synthesize everything we've learned about psychological influence, as we convert these potentially problematic tools into instruments of genuine connection and personal development, we're approaching the most crucial question: how do you integrate this knowledge into daily life in ways that make you not simply more influential, but genuinely more deserving of the influence you possess? What if the ultimate mastery of cognitive biases isn't developing greater skill in their application, but gaining wisdom about when to abandon them entirely? What if genuine psychological sophistication means achieving such confidence in your authentic self that you no longer require mental manipulation as a relationship navigation tool? As we conclude our exploration through the complexities of psychological influence and ethical application, we encounter perhaps the most profound question: what constitutes authentic power in a world where everyone attempts to psychologically influence everyone else? Carl Jung's concept of psychological integration provides an elegant framework for understanding this paradox. Jung theorized that genuine psychological maturity emerges from integrating all personality dimensions: our shadow and illuminated aspects, our rational and emotional components, our power drives and capacity for compassion. When you've authentically integrated your cognitive bias understanding, you're not perpetually calculating their strategic deployment. Instead, you've achieved what Jung termed individuation, the capacity for authentic self-expression while comprehending the psychological forces shaping human behavior. This integration doesn't render you psychologically naive or vulnerable. Precisely the opposite occurs. When you understand cognitive bias mechanics, you develop manipulation immunity while simultaneously becoming more genuinely compelling. You no longer feel compelled to trigger others' psychological responses because you trust your authentic self merits genuine connection. This confidence, this self-assurance, requiring neither external validation nor psychological techniques, may represent the most magnetic human quality possible. Daniel Kahneman's research on rational thinking provides practical frameworks for maintaining psychological integrity in daily experience. He demonstrated that our minds constantly gravitate toward biased thinking, but bias awareness constitutes the foundational step toward cognitive freedom. Consider developing a daily practice of auditing your psychological responses. Each morning, ask yourself, which cognitive biases am I most susceptible to today? What artificial scarcity pressures am I experiencing? What social proof am I unconsciously seeking? This daily psychological maintenance becomes powerful mental wellness practice. Rather than using knowledge to manipulate others, you're applying it to liberate yourself from manipulation by unconscious patterns. When you notice yourself desiring something primarily due to perceived scarcity, pause and evaluate whether you genuinely value it. When social proof influences surface, check alignment with authentic preferences. When reciprocity obligations arise, choose responses from genuine appreciation rather than psychological compulsion. Marcus Aurelius, in his private reflections that became meditations, captured something essential about psychological mastery approaches. He emphasized living according to virtue rather than others' opinions or potential gains from them. In cognitive bias mastery contexts, this Stoic wisdom translates to using psychological knowledge for personal character development rather than manipulation expertise. Envision approaching every social interaction from virtue-driven authenticity. Instead of asking, "How can I influence this person?" you inquire, "How can I be genuinely helpful and honest in this exchange?" Rather than calculating psychological effects, focus on presence, curiosity, and kindness. The paradox: this approach often generates far greater attraction and influence than any manipulation technique because people instinctively recognize genuine concern for their well-being. Allow me to share one final experience that crystallizes this entire journey. Recently, I encountered a situation where I could have easily employed several discussed techniques to create favorable impressions. I was meeting someone whose professional assessment could significantly impact my career trajectory, and I felt familiar temptation to deploy my psychological knowledge. I could have anchored their perception through strategic achievement mentions, utilized social proof by referencing impressive connections, or manufactured artificial scarcity around my availability. Instead, I made a conscious decision to simply be authentic. I expressed honest uncertainties, demonstrated genuine curiosity about their work, and maintained transparency about my relationship hopes. I didn't attempt communication style mirroring or cognitive bias triggering. The conversation became one of my most rewarding professional interactions in years, generating opportunities I couldn't have manufactured through psychological manipulation. More significantly, it established a relationship founded on mutual respect and genuine appreciation rather than strategic positioning. This experience illuminated something crucial. The most powerful psychological state you can cultivate isn't others' influence capability, but inner security that makes influence unnecessary. When you're genuinely comfortable with your identity, when you trust your authentic self possesses inherent value and connection worthiness, you naturally attract people who appreciate you for genuine reasons. Here's my challenge for you, and I genuinely want to hear your experiences in the comments. Design a personal psychology experiment for the coming week. Select one cognitive bias we've explored and commit to either using it ethically to enhance authentic connections or developing immunity when others attempt its use against you. Perhaps you'll practice reciprocity through expectation-free giving or develop scarcity resistance by questioning urgency-driven decisions. Share your experimental plan in the comments, then return next week to report your results. These real-world applications transform psychological knowledge into practical wisdom. The future of human connection in 2025 and beyond doesn't require domination by manipulation and psychological conflict. It can represent an era of unprecedented authenticity, where expanding mind understanding becomes a tool for deeper empathy, more genuine relationships, and greater personal freedom. That future depends on conscious choices each of us makes daily. If this exploration of ethical cognitive bias mastery has ignited your curiosity about psychology and human potential intersections, ensure you subscribe to whatifmindlab. We continuously explore psychological research frontiers and examine questions helping us understand not just mind mechanics, but how to leverage that knowledge for more meaningful, authentic, and genuinely fulfilling lives. Because ultimately, the most profound "what if" question isn't about mastering others, it's discovering what becomes possible when you finally achieve self-mastery.